Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of A Writer's History of Science Fiction, where I interview real-life authors about their personal take on the genre. And if you hear any background noise, it's because the cicadas have finally shown up where I live. I'm Alex Howe, and usually I interview fellow fiction writers, but for this episode, we have a professional historian on the show. Dr. Benjamin Stevens is a visiting professor of classical studies at Trinity University. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Reed College and earned his PhD at the University of Chicago, where he wrote his dissertation about the origins of language in Greek and Roman thought. Ben's current research includes ancient literature in light of modern discourses and classical traditions and reception studies, especially in science fiction and fantasy. He wrote the book Silence in Catullus, exploring the themes in the writings of the Roman poet Catullus, along with numerous book chapters and articles. And obviously it's the science fiction bit that we're focusing on today. So hello, Ben. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thanks for the invitation.
Happy to have you. So first, for listeners who may not be familiar with the term, what is classical reception studies?
That's a great question, which I'm happy to say is also debated within the term as an etymological footnote. I'd start by saying some of the confusion comes because it's a term in translation. In the German, where the term originates, it much more strongly has the technical sense that I'll go on to name. Of course, in English, reception means all sorts of other things, and we think, frankly, of a sort of cocktail party after a major event. So reception studies is asking the question, how is it that later cultures and other peoples make use of earlier materials? In particular, in the study of media cultures, it's a question about audiences, the sociology or the composition of an audience, and how those factors affect their response to witnessing media. Classical reception studies then asks the question of, sort of in a similar way, how later audiences in their various ways receive, both transmit, but also transform ancient materials.
Okay. And this usually means Greco-Roman materials, but it can mean any sort of antiquity?
This is a very good question, too. Classical, as a term which in fact does come from antiquity, as an academic field has been used especially of the literary cultures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So yes, Greece and Rome, but in recent generations, but especially recent years, there's been an interest in making sure that other cultures of Mediterranean antiquity have been studied as well, and a kind of expanding scope into the ancient Near East. So I'm so glad we're starting this question, because when we do turn to the research as such, I'll say again, my colleague Brett Rogers and I desperately wish we had called the first book something other than Classical Traditions in Science Fiction, something like Ancient Stories in Science Fiction, and that would have helped us to be more comprehensive. But yes, shortest answer, central to the field above all has been Greece and Rome, but interested in expanding the scope further.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I've seen the same thing going on in other areas. Like I have a passing interest in linguistics, and the more recent literature on that, the older literature has a lot of Greek and Roman linguistics, but talking about the history of the alphabet and such. But more recent literature gets a lot more into Etruscan and Phoenician and other branches of what the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet became.
I think we do see that, and what you're pointing to, Alex, which is so fascinating, and again, my colleague Brett and I think is really, even if unconsciously, at the heart of these sort of expansions of scope, is the realization that to focus too narrowly on any certain culture, but especially too narrowly on the literature produced by people who used to be the ruling elite, sort of unfairly, even unjustly excludes the very wide range of human experience. And so as a linguistic footnote, I would say I would love it if we had more Etruscan. Maybe at a certain point we can rehearse the story of one of the longest texts in Etruscan, which, as you probably know, was discovered wrapped around a mummy And I think at some point, if we end up discussing the ancient or alien astronaut theory and 19th century European Egyptomania, inevitably we'll touch on mummies, linguistics nearby, and the question of still expanding that scope. So yes, I do think we see a lot of that.
And before we get into it, I have to ask, what led you to studying classical reception in science fiction as one of your areas of research?
So this is the ringer question for me, and I'm so grateful for it. Two things, essentially, and although despite knowing that the podcast is mainly about written science fiction, of course I'll be naming a number of films, especially as we see endless amount of crossover between the two areas now. I think with novels written with film adaptation in mind, or at least affecting their aesthetics. And so a couple of films especially. In my first year in college, I saw Stargate. Mm-hmm. And I was a math major at the time, intending to specialize in topology. And yet I was also taking a course there at Reed College, which was required of every first-year student, called Hume 110, Humanities 110, which was ancient Greece in the fall, Rome and early Christian materials in the spring. And so in the fall, thinking of myself as a mathematician, but increasingly steeped in these ancient materials, I saw Stargate at the theater at the Clackamas Town Center there in Portland, Oregon. And I was so struck by the constellation of my own interests and this fictional, but nonetheless very enthralling possibility. If there were to be contact with extraterrestrials, somebody would need to be able to try to learn and speak their language. And of course, it's additionally fascinating that it's travel to an exoticized location. That can be problematic, and we could return to that. The sweeping strings in the background music, I was so struck, and over the next year or so, partly inspired by that, I reconfigured my studies to ancient languages. Years and years later, I reconnected with a fellow Reedie, Brett Rogers, who had been a year behind me there at Reed, was also majoring in classics. And we discovered, as both of us had become professional classicists, scholars in the field, that as a kind of sidebar, each had maintained an interest in science fiction, in fantasy. Brett had published a single co-authored piece on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I had written a piece on a comic book called Blankets, and we sat down at a conference at one point, put our heads together, and realized that this had always been unconsciously our intention since when we were at Reed. We were dorm parents or resident advisors for a newly instituted Greek and Latin language dorm. And as part of our official duties, aside from greeting the students in togas and laurel garlands, we held a weekly screening that we called Wacky Classics Movie Night, one of which films was the 1986 animated movie Transformers the Movie. And at the time, we were making the argument entirely tongue-in-cheek that all of the robots, all the Transformers have got ancient-sounding names. The Decepticons have Greek-sounding names, Megatron. The Autobots have Latinate-sounding names, Optimus Prime. And we elaborated this fictional argument that therefore we have a kind of staging of what's called the classical tradition, the resistance of Romans to Greek cultural supremacy, and shooting across the bow that wonderful Orson Welles figure of Unicron, representing in our ham-fisted reading the barbarians causing the fall of the Roman Empire. So I probably shouldn't have gone on record about this, but Stargate, with its sort of American imperialist vision of the ancient astronaut theory, and Transformers the movie, the first time I, at least as a child, heard an animated figure use a curse word, these were the two things together that pushed me into this field.
Okay, that's an interesting history.
Yeah.
I got started with Star Trek, but I did get pretty deep into Stargate SG-1, the TV show. And I've toyed with ancient aliens in my writings, still working out where I want to go with it.
Alex, which Star Trek was the one that really hit for you?
Well, the first one I was old enough to pay attention to was Voyager.
Okay.
I definitely got into reruns of Next Generation and the original series.
Interesting. My folks, I think each differently, had been interested in the original series. And in my own childhood, I remember us getting often takeout Chinese food and sitting down to what were then new releases of the Next Generation, the TV flickering in the corner. I can't quite say that at that youthful age I recognized ancient stories in it. Of course, there's that famous moment when Picard, who finds himself on a planet, I want to say, or at least opposite an individual whose culture explains things always in metaphorical stories.
Darmok.
Thank you very much for the title. Tells the story of Gilgamesh.
Mm-hmm.
Now I can see that for what it is. Of course, that's the work, as you say, going backwards to reinvigorate the older things with the new interest. And that exactly, you've just defined it better than I did earlier. Going backwards to reinvigorate older things with new interest, that's the subject of reception studies.
Now, obviously, you study classical reception in many fields, but especially in science fiction and fantasy. But as we've been discussing, there's a lot of classical influence in the culture generally.
Mm-hmm.
So what makes science fiction distinctive in classical reception?
It's a great question. I hope that there's an answer, partly because, of course, I'm staking my professional career on that possibility. But you've really asked the question that increasingly, at least Brett and I and some others working in the field, find ourselves looking backwards to ask. And I'm just going to ask it again. Is there something distinctive about how science fiction and fantasy, about how speculative fiction uses antiquity, distinctive, as you say, from the culture at large? And I would add, is it distinctive from how SF&F uses other cultures in general? And I just want to repeat that because I think it's so crucial, and I think it's potentially destabilizing or even destructive. It's not clear, and this is the sort of focus of the research, first of all, whether science fiction uses antiquity in ways that are distinct from the culture at large, from its use of other old things or other things. And secondly, within that, if there's something which is distinctive to the so-called classical cultures of Greece and Rome. So in our prep for the interview, we touched on a couple of historical facts, and I want to name those in a second, but the framework that we've been developing to try to answer this question is to see whether we can move past what would be a kind of surface level or superficial approach, noticing Picard tells the story of Gilgamesh in Darmok. Many objects in space-based science fiction happen to have classical names because of the history of astronomy, right? These sort of superficial connections. Moving deeper than that, we notice that there are historical connections where, not accidentally, somewhat richly, there are points of contact between science fiction as a modern genre and a tradition coming from antiquity. Something like Mary Shelley consciously subtitles Frankenstein, arguably the modern point of origin for science fiction, consciously subtitles it the modern Prometheus. And we can see then, as our colleague Genevieve Lively has demonstrated, that from Mary Shelley's reading journals, she was actively reading ancient classics at the time of composing that story, so that there is that conscious infiltration. But even that might end up being superficial or incidental and not quite central. So what we're hoping to be able to show is that the distinctive use by science fiction and fantasy of classics isn't superficial, isn't even merely historical, but is what we're calling sort of more deeply metaphysical, showing a similarity between these two major areas insofar as imagining worlds in the future. If we consider that to be science fiction, imagining worlds off to the side in another reality, if that's the stuff of fantasy, is a similar activity for the reader to reconstructing an ancient world also in their mind. And so if that's right, science fiction, fantasy, antiquity all have in common the fact that in different ways they're not real. If that's right, then our argument which again I hope doesn't collapse, is that science fiction is distinctive in its approach to antiquity in being aware of that similarity and mobilizing the ancient world as a kind of metaphor for itself. And that would get us back to things like the ancient or alien astronaut theory in Stargate, where pretty clearly the oldness of the mythology is equivalent of distance. And so here's my topological mind coming back in once more. It might as well just be far away, but instead it is a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So the equation between those two things, I think, is what we're seeing science fiction uses to make its use of antiquity distinct.
Mm-hmm. And as a layperson, I feel like that is probably more true from the broader perspective of speculative fiction. And that's something I discussed back in episode 1. Speculative fiction is just the fiction of the unreal. It includes science fiction, fantasy, horror, alternate history, dystopian fiction. It's very broad, and I think the very fact of naming it speculative fiction has a perspective of, creating these other worlds.
The otherness of it, I think you're right that that's so central to it, and there really is that question which the field of classics is wrestling with. As you pointed out, fields like linguistics are also exploring. The question is whether there is something distinctly significant to the objects that have happened to be studied, or whether we have there a kind of combination of the accident of history, in the case of materials from antiquity, the accident of preservation, and on the other hand, the usual human thing of confirmation bias. Right? So I love this stuff, therefore I need the stuff to be meaningful, and this kind of closed loop develops. Alex, I need to go back and listen to that first episode, because I am thinking actively about that supercategory of speculative fiction. I'm especially confronted by my students with versions of this question. Right? If we trot out these definitions of science fiction, well, it's a genre that represents the world other than what it is. It encourages thinking. You think about theories of history. The students have asked, isn't that what all fiction does? Isn't the definition of fiction that it isn't real? I sit there thinking, this is a great question. I don't have an answer to it. How is it different looking at science fiction from looking at House Hunters International, baking shows, right? Reality TV? If it's all fictional, are the genres distinguished by their relationship to the mode of speculation? Is the mode of speculation distinct because of the manner of referring to history? I'm just multiplying questions because I don't quite know.
Yeah. And one interesting point of contrast I thought of when you mentioned objects in space as frequently having this Greco-Roman tradition, my first thought was Rendezvous with Rama, which, of course, is a Hindu name that was assigned just because it was discovered as an asteroid in the story. And, of course, Arthur Clarke lived most of his life in Sri Lanka.
That's right.
And many of his books, especially The Fountains of Paradise, is very steeped in Sri Lankan culture. So he kind of took a different path from a lot of science fiction writers.
That's an interesting observation, and I'm just spitballing here. But in relationship to the observation, I would wonder whether, looking closely at something like naming conventions in science, and at least for a while derived from that naming conventions in science fiction, we would find these sorts of cultural shifts or shift of focus of interest in other cultures. I think you're absolutely right that if at first the history of naming conventions in astronomy is steeped in the Greek and Roman classics. Obviously, that has so much to do with the tradition of European and Anglo-American education up to that point of consisting in primary school of learning to read Latin, learning to read Greek, etc. But once the educational tradition is then kind of decoupled from the classics, and the ancient classics are no longer central, I literally don't know this, but the naming convention in some span of time must then be separated from that possibility. At some point, you run out of classical names. Other cultures come into the play. I'm intrigued by the example of things like Rama, because it does make me wonder whether we see there the author's idiosyncratic interest in that other culture. You mentioned, of course, Clarke's long-term residence in Sri Lanka. Long-term enough, I think that when he began, it was still Ceylon.
I think it was.
And yet we could tie that individual kind of interest to things like the major cultural interest I mentioned earlier, late 19th century European fascination with Egypt, consequent upon the decipherment at last of hieroglyphics, thanks to the French linguist Champollion. This startling idea that ancient things haven't been available continuously from their own antiquity, but that they have emerged now and emerged again into every given modern moment. And I keep going back to Darmok, which I hadn't intended to talk about, but I'm delighted is now on the table. Gilgamesh is maybe the most vivid example of that. Among the oldest stories that we collectively have access to, and yet also among the most recent to arrive back in modern consciousness, lost for millennia, and rendered into an English translation, just for example, only in the third quarter of the 19th century. So it's fascinating to think that the most ancient things can also be, because of that accident of history, the most modern, or at least the most recent. Very interesting to see that at work.
I can tell you that naming conventions have changed. We've long since run out of low-hanging fruit for asteroid names. And today, many asteroids are named after scientists and historical figures. And comets are named after their discoverers. And astronomy has made a very conscious shift to a multicultural, inclusive stance. Like Oumuamua, the interstellar asteroid that was discovered a couple of years ago that some people thought was an alien spaceship, it was given a Hawaiian name after the Keck telescope that discovered it being in Hawaii.
Mm-hmm. That impetus, although this wasn't the point of origin in the field, I go back to the title, Classical Traditions. The impetus that you're naming is part of the history of the field's awareness of itself. The so-called classical tradition had in mind the image of ancient things sort of simply being handed over to each next generation. In fact, the ancient image of that, which was then carried into the manuscript tradition of the medieval period, was of a torch. And each next person in this sort of millennia-long relay race was carrying on the torch of knowledge, the torch of civilization, right? The light of illumination, the light of enlightenment, rather. But with an interest in democratization of education and in opening up the scope to the widest possible range of people, there has been in the humanities too the equivalent of that interest in a greater multiculturalism. And it's there precisely that we get the difference between the tradition, so-called, and an interest in reception studies, where the question once more is, what have people, emphatically plural, done with these ancient things? What are their own ancient things, and how should those different sets of ancient things be sort of aligned together? So it's an old story, right? Can we topple the gods and still keep sort of the cool aspects of them? Can different people have different gods, and each of those has their significance in a way that is not a threat or a challenge to the others, but is a sort of enrichment? And it's there that we're really finding, I'm thinking of my students' experience in the class that I teach, Classics and Science Fiction. It's in that connection that we're really finding the more people are given the opportunity to understand the various ancient roots of these modern speculative fictional genres, the richer those genres become. Right? Mm-hmm. Clarke, for example, certainly would love people to know, as you've mentioned, Alex, that Rama is a name from a particular cultural tradition, and that must change the atmosphere, change the flavor. It changes the reception of the story if the reader does have that knowledge.
And I will say science fiction has also moved towards inclusivity in recent years. Maybe the most publicized example is Black Panther, mm-hmm. which The mythology in that one has definite issues. They're in East Africa and they worship an Egyptian goddess and a Hindu god. The
Yes.
Jabari worship Hanuman, but it's Afrofuturism. It's
Mhm.
very steeped in African culture, even though the mythology is problematic.
Yes, and I'm thinking about that too. I'm thinking about literary works like Binti. Of course, one thinks of Octavia Butler and the presence that has always been there, even if science fiction, even in that name, which, as I know I don't need to say to you or to your listeners, is a recent invention relative to even the first appearances of materials that are later considered to belong to that field. The name frames it as being a matter implicitly of, call it modern European and Anglo-American technoscience. But of course, there has always been science. There has been expert knowledge of different kinds. And to realize more and more that as a result, there have always been different traditions of speculation relative to those different cultures, sets of science or knowledge, it's just endless. I agree with you. It's problematic or complicated to see a culture looking at another and making sort of inexpert or awkward fumbling use of various materials. That can be colonialist, it can be imperialist. I suppose it could also be innocent. It's hard to think of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise like the Marvel Cinematic Universe as being innocent. But the sort of examples you're citing give me hope that we really are continuing in a direction of increased multiculturalism, increased diversity and representation in these fields that we love so much.
And this conversation kind of leads into the second topic I wanted to address, which is science fiction tends to be seen as a very modernist genre in the colloquial sense of the word, a very forward-looking genre, techno science, it's in the name. And I know some writers, I mentioned David Brin in the prep for this interview, are very deliberate about taking that angle. So this is sort of a competing tradition in the genre. And how has that affected the relationship between sci-fi and the classical tradition?
I think that's a great question, and I'm so grateful for the way that you've formulated it, in which, as a kind of miniature reception history, the sort of science fiction that is most overtly interested in, call it progress. We should call it uplift, right? Thinking about Brin. In technology or knowledge generally as leading to uplift really does seem to be distinct from the classical inheritance in other sorts of science fiction where knowledge is the problem, right? Where technology is either the root of or the form taken by evil. And of course, here I'm thinking once more about the progenitor Mary Shelley, whose understanding of the Prometheus myth leads to that sort of other darker or that other negative strain of science fiction where humankind's reach exceeds its grasp, and its reach also exceeds its sort of ethical limitation.
Yeah. I'll have a lot to say about this when I get to Michael Crichton.
Okay. Oh, great. No, and that's the fact that there have been sort of hand in hand or simultaneously at least these two strains of speculative fiction. You said Crichton, and now I can't stop using medical metaphor, strains of science fiction. I'm spitballing again a little, but as a gut reaction, I would say I imagine less classical reception in the uplift-oriented science fiction than in the Promethean type. And I'm not sure I could put money on that, but I do think the thing that we've found most often, not to the exclusion of other ancient stories, but most often science fiction draws on antiquity for images of knowledge as hubris, overweening arrogance, transgression beyond a boundary, which is then restored through the negative device of nemesis. Knowledge leads to punishment. Or more recently, sort of structures of society that are negative. You mentioned earlier dystopia. And very often, at least in the Anglo-American tradition, we find those framed in terms that are recognizably ancient, things like republics gone awry, empires in consciously Roman modes. And so I want to think about this more, but I'm interested in the possibility that science fiction or speculative fiction in a more positive mood, a more uplifted interest in the potential for technoscience, that kind of science fiction may be less classically receptive or may use the ancient classics less often.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about that now.
Yeah, I think there's a trend in that direction. Although going back to Star Trek presents a very optimistic view of the future, but still invokes antiquity quite a lot directly in episodes like Who Mourns for Adonais with Apollo, and also indirectly, like the Romulan Empire is definitely based on the Roman Empire.
Just so. And then the ancient Roman historian wonders, is it the same backstory that a Romulus defeated a Remulus, and as a result, it's the one empire?
Well, in Star Trek Nemesis, there's that word again.
Right.
Remus is sort of the vassal planet to Romulus.
It's fascinating. Well, and of course, that large-scale metaphor being the case, it means that the Federation is either an alternative to these sort of degraded versions of antiquity, or is another kind of thing entirely. And I'd be interested in your much more expert thoughts about how the Star Trek extended universe, if we can call it that, frames that.
In the extended universe, I believe the Federation is meant to be a space United Nations.
Interesting. And the United Nations, of course, being entirely modern. As historians, we would call it contemporary, right, emerging from the League of Nations, but following upon World War II. I suppose if Roddenberry really is doing the work there, the Federation, strictly speaking, does not have an ancient model. And then antiquity is sort of pushed to the edges, and we would think of things like the Romulan Empire. I think of the planet or society whose name I forget in Bread and Circuses. Plato's stepchildren, where there are, as you say, there are these overt looks in the direction of antiquity, but they're always not the Federation. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in that displacement. I think that does seem to map onto your notion that the more forward-looking, including in those instances multicultural, but the more uplifted in tone versions are the less classical in that story world. It's a very interesting possibility.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the contrast within the universe, but that's pretty clear when you think about it. If the Federation's the space UN, I mean, originally, in the original series, the Klingons were the Soviet Union and the Romulans were the Chinese. But in the later series, you definitely have more of this Roman aesthetic for the Romulans. And, I don't know, maybe Norse for the Klingons?
Interesting. And Alex, I would ask you there, and I don't mean for this to be a leading question. It will seem as if it's confirming part of my own research, but is that shift in the sort of underlying point of reference for the extended Star Trek universe, clearly it has something to do with the writers or the studio's expectation of audience knowledge, right? It can no longer be counted on that the audience is steeped in the geopolitics of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. We're no longer in those geopolitics, although there are equivalents to them, such that the points of reference are changed. And yet the Federation stays fixed in place. I don't quite have the question formulated, but I'd be interested to get your sense of whether, as a result, the Romulans becoming more Roman is because of how, as it were, nobody owns Rome, or more precisely, no living people has inherited it. There is a Rome still, but in terms of ancient Rome, there isn't a direct line of ancestry that the creators of the show are interested in, as opposed to one could imagine offense or some other kind of objection to a coded depiction of Russian culture, a coded depiction of Chinese people. These would be objectionable, whereas something ancient owned by no one, it feels more like a blank space on the map.
Yeah, I think I can speak to that more with the Klingons.
Hmm.
Because in the original series, the Klingons were a coded representation of the Soviet Union, which by the later seasons of Next Generation is anachronistic on top of problematic.
That's right.
And they made a lot of changes to the Klingons so that by the time of the Next Generation, I think Norse is a pretty good analogy because they have Sto-vo-kor, where warriors go when they die.
That's very interesting.
And and that seems to be a case of shifting it off of current geopolitics into something that doesn't have a direct representation today.
I'm glad to hear that offered as a potential reading. Partly, again, I don't mean for this to be completely self-serving, but it does help speak to the question that you asked first of all about distinctiveness. Are there ways in which science fiction, and we're talking now speculative fiction more generally, makes use of antiquity, performs classical receptions that are distinct from what the culture does? And the Star Trek example is great because we have a kind of longitudinal study of how that changes in a shared universe subjected to widespread audience reception. And it really does seem then that, at least in context of that longitudinal study, that antiquity has come back as a place onto which otherness can be projected in a more neutral mode, or at least superficially a less political mode, because again, so nobody living is at least as directly connected to the imagined worlds of antiquity as they are to the imagined communities of modern nation states. So from this perspective, science fiction, I suppose, is doing what a lot of other modes in the culture also do, which is to project otherness onto distant things. In this case, again, distant in time. But I'm forced to say, going back to your second version of that earlier question, that it's increasingly less clear to me whether there's something distinctive about Greece and Rome specifically, or it's just ancient will do, anything old will do as a space for that projection.
And maybe that's a good segue into the third topic, which is the ancient aliens, because we both like Stargate, and the conceit of Stargate is that all mythology is ancient aliens. And just to be clear, it's not Aliens History Channel guy. But there's a definite strain in the culture of this ancient astronaut trope that Stargate makes great use of.
You surely know, Alex, the modern history of the ancient alien trope. And we would think of something like the 1968 publication of Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods, right? A name not chosen incidentally, but from the title on, linking, as you say, speculation about potential for technology to speculation about how technology must have been involved in history, and therefore has led through that almost sort of Tolkien-like process of history becoming legend, legend becoming myth, to a speculation about pan-cultural myths deriving from old memories of contact with higher technology. There's something there which is so fascinating. I should responsibly say there's something there, of course, which is potentially odious, and scholars and others are right to offer critique of ancient alien theory when it is not ironic, as being at least potentially racist, right? Dismissing the accomplishments of other cultures by assigning them to imaginary aliens in order to sort of uphold a sense of the projecting culture's superiority. The usual example there, of course, with Stargate in mind, and this is von Däniken's example, is that it was and in some quarters is still disbelieved that ancient Egyptians could have built the pyramids. But of course we know that they did, and it's fascinating to see the actual engineering makes it even more amazing.
Yeah, the pyramids are crazy from a historical perspective. They were the biggest thing we ever built up until the Middle Ages and maybe even early modern period. And it was one of the first large structures in the historical record.
Right. Thinking back to our sort of mutual interest in mathematics, and the question I'm going to keep returning to of distinctiveness, of course, it's a question that can be approached statistically. The humanities, as you know, historically has not been terrific, either about mobilizing mathematics or, once doing so, about continuing to do so ethically. And we get into weird problems like quantification leading to metrics of humanity, which is bad news, very bad news farther down the line. But closer to the surface, one of the major problems in this kind of research is figuring out whether what you've got is an example of the sort of thing that does happen or is an exception. Have you got something that shows what the rule is, if only you had more data? Or have you got something which needs its own sort of special kind of accounting? And I take it that something like the ancient or alien astronaut theory is, however imaginative it might seem, actually can be looked at as a failure of the imagination, right? The person projecting the theory can't imagine how they would solve that engineering problem. And they extend that to not being able to imagine that anybody else could. Well, of course, a number of other people did. My brother and I joke about this quite a bit. We can't imagine how someone first of all solved the problem of building a bridge over a river. If it were left to us, with our interest in language and discourse, we would have tried to develop a cultural mythos in which it was simply understood you don't cross the river. It's dangerous over there. And we live very happily on this side. My other major example, I'm going off the track a bit, but this will circle us back, is driving through a city and noticing construction cranes atop buildings, building other buildings. How did the cranes get there? And I'm right on the verge of thinking, as per sort of Stephen Hawking's example from the public lecture, it turtles all the way down. We know, in fact, it is not turtles all the way down. Eventually, there is a bottom turtle. The ancient Egyptians certainly built the pyramids, and we can see the framework for it, the planing of the earth until the water in the rivets runs smooth. But the idea that something monumental would be taken as an exception, an historical oddity, and then onto that oddity there is projected an entire elaborate mythology, that's so fascinating. And I think that part of what it does that gets us back to the topic at hand is each of those exceptions sort of simultaneously is an example of where technology could go and a symbol of the imagined relationship between the present and the past. And I just want to say that again and slightly differently. I think of something like the pyramids in von Daniken's theory or in Stargate. I think about something like Rama, or if we look at Jack McDevitt's work, sort of monuments in space. Charlie Strauss's convergence, divergence, transcendence material. The idea that there are enormous things in scale, or there is an enormity in their quality built by other cultures, does seem to be a point of contact between science fiction, right, interested in that technological possibility someday, and the humanities, where we know, in fact, those sorts of things have already been built. And so I guess what I'm coming back to is some of the distinctiveness or the interest in the crossover field seems to lie in how, as you said earlier, in the feeling that's inspired by something technological, that possibility of wonder. The question then becomes, is the wonder a positive or a negative? And that seems to lead to these different areas of myth.
And one thing you mentioned in prepping for the interview is alternate history versus secret history. And first off, what's the distinction between the two, and how does that figure into this ancient alien trope?
Great question. Alternate history versus secret history. What's the difference and how does it relate to this central recurring trope in science fiction? So as in my response to how it is that I became interested in this field, I need to give a two-part answer. From the perspective of classical studies, part of the answer comes from the title of a novel by the American author Donna Tartt. The novel is called The Secret History. And the idea is that sort of hidden beneath the surface of the world, if the veil is peeled back, there is a different metaphysics, which often has to do with a small group of expert individuals, expert in esoteric knowledge, even magical knowledge, right? Secretly controlling all things. The most familiar form of that, of course, is the Illuminati. And I'm wondering, as many of us are, whether we're about to see, thanks to the convergence of various corporate cultures, the emergence of the equivalent Illuminati in the extended Marvel Cinematic Universe. Are we going to get Doctor Strange alongside Professor Xavier, paired with a latter-day Tony Stark, Reed Richards, etc., right? Secretly controlling all things. Black Bolt, for that matter. So secret history in the classical studies framework is the idea that there is a mythology underpinning all things. The mythology is correct. And so I would put something like the alien or ancient astronaut theory in that connection. That actual history has been made possible by something that we don't yet know but could know. And if we ended up knowing it, that would be the matter of fact. Secret history. Alternate history, the acknowledgement that the proposal for a difference is a different world entirely. That the discovery is not a matter of fact that changes the record. It is kept continuously under the cover of the alternative or speculation. And the distinction between the two, secret and alternate, was driven home to me in a tweet. When I had tweeted my enthusiasm for a trilogy that I dearly love, and the first novel of which I was teaching in my course on classics and science fiction, Joe Walton's Thessaly trilogy, the first novel of which, as you must know, is called The Just City, in which the premise is the time-traveling gods, Athena and Apollo, have instituted in the real world a practical experimental version of Plato's ideal of the Republic. Right? Traveling through time, they have gathered philosophers, they have gathered children freed from enslavement, and from our near future, they have gathered what end up being revealed to be, and excuse me for the spoiler, artificially intelligent robot assistants, all to put together a practical version of Plato's Republic on the volcanic island of Thera ahead of its historical volcanic eruption in the late Bronze Age around 1200 BCE. I tweeted enthusiastically about teaching this as part of a segment in my course on alternate history. We start with Joe Walton's Just City as our kind of archaic Greek example. We move from there to Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games as a Roman historical example, since, of course, the future American dystopia of Panem is based on mid-20th century depictions of the Roman Empire in film. And from there, we go to Walter M. Miller Jr.'s A Canticle for Leibowitz, which takes the whole scope of the classical tradition, the ancient, the medieval, the modern, and maps that onto the near future. And Joe Walton responded there on Twitter to say, as a point of clarification about her trilogy, not alternate history, secret history. And so my students and I, armed with the author's statement about her own work, then had to try to consider whether the author was correct. How does it change our reading if the premise that there are time-traveling gods moving through history is the real history and not speculative fiction? Does it change our response to the material? We had a wonderful conversation about that. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts at some point about that possibility and other listeners' thoughts. Does it make a difference if we treat the speculative possibility not as fiction, but as a matter of fact that only accidentally has been concealed or not known. And I'm saying a lot about this because I love the topic so much, but it leads to a question that I have seen best made graphical by the webcomic XKCD, charting the relationship between the publication date of a work of science fiction. You've seen this chart. I can see the work's fictional setting and the moment at which its fictional date has changed into the past. And it's such a beautiful demonstration of the moment when science fiction stops being speculative and, at least according to this technical definition, becomes alternate history. It was startling to me, for example, to wake up one morning and realize I was about to live in a world where Blade Runner could no longer be speculative fiction and had become alternate history, since we were now past its fictional setting in 2019.
The one that comes to mind for me is Back to the Future Part 2, which is set in 2015.
No hoverboards. And instead, we only have sort of cheapo 3D versions of blockbuster films. We did get that. I did have the hat, but I gave it away to a student as a graduation gift.
And I would say for Hunger Games and Canticle for Leibowitz, those weren't really alternate history. They were just future history, even though they had these classical themes.
That's a good distinction. Of course, you're right that from Collins' perspective, writing when she did about the future date, that's speculative future history. Likewise, Walter M. Miller Jr. I guess the difference between those two for me, and I'm glad to be circling back to this under cover of alternate versus secret history. Suzanne Collins imagines something happening which seems like a development of present trend. Of course, she's also interested, for example, in the sort of future development of the reality TV experience. Mm-hmm. And if that's mapped onto society as a whole, what is the result? By some contrast, I really take it that Walter M. Miller Jr., in his experience in the service, was so struck by the singularity of atomic warfare, the sort of thing that had never happened before, was so struck by that difference. It's almost as if he, in his fiction, imagines that we are all now living in an alternate history, that the whole world is different than it could have been, as if there was that John Barr hinge in the invention of nuclear weaponry, and the timeline has now gone off the track. And I'm thinking, maybe I'm influenced now by Back to the Future too, where it's palpable that one is living in the wrong world. It shouldn't have been this way. I agree with you. I'm certain, as you say, that Collins isn't imagining the world as it stands as being different from as it should have been. I think that Walter M. Miller Jr. has that darker feeling that given the arrival of this technology, everything is different, and it's almost as if that difference works backwards through time, sort of warping prior history.
Interesting point of view. You do see a lot of that kind of attitude in this early Cold War era stuff. You know, Alas, Babylon, On the Beach. Well, On the Beach everybody dies, but
just
slightly different.
War Day.
Although, I mean, you can get the same kind of effect from natural disasters, like Larry Niven and Edward Lerner's Lucifer's Hammer, which I'll talk about in the next episode, which of course is a comet impact, which has many similar effects to nuclear war.
This will seem tangential, but Alex, you're dislodging a thought, which is something that my students and I are now considering as we move from science fiction to fantasy. And earlier you mentioned the genre we're working on now, which is horror. The thought you're dislodging is the question of whether science fiction's engagement with ancient material takes on different subgenres at different scales. So we're sort of touching now on global events, or even indeed on cosmic events, things of a scale such that sort of a given natural or a given technological occurrence is apocalyptic, as opposed to what happens if the plot is centered on a household, right, or even an individual. Not that there can't be apocalyptic scale films or stories whose telling is centered on the experience of an individual or a household. But the question of whether, for example, something like horror, which has consisted so much in the invasion of the domestic space, right, that the infiltration of the house distinguishes itself from these other genres by not being about the sort of larger imagined world of fantasy or the larger imagined cosmos of science fiction. And if there is that difference in scale, does that change how each of those genres relates to or uses the ancient? That's something that we're exploring right now. And I think once that exploration has been started, I could come back to the question about alternate versus secret history and say something more, maybe more comprehensible, more intelligent. We're finding, for example, that at least so far, rather more horror has been interested in secret history than has proposed alternate history. The latter certainly exists, but it's dwarfed by the sort of protagonist discovery that there is an evil history that has been operating behind the scenes.
And that also has a long tradition. Like even Dracula was kind of meant to be a loose secret history of Jack the Ripper.
Just so, the kind of open conspiracy later imagined by H.G. Wells.
Of course, if you go there with horror, you face the challenge of the crossover between the two, which is Lovecraft.
This is the challenge that we're facing. In addition to the challenge, and this is not to pass judgment on anyone's taste, including my own. A question that a colleague asked quite early on when I was starting to be interested in studying science fiction. I won't out them, but they asked, "Is it worth it?" I said, "Well, what do you mean? Is it worth it?" I said, "Well, is the material of any quality?" And I thought to myself, and I sort of said out loud in the conversation, what a prejudicial response, right? Quite obviously, here are fields that are of interest to any number of people. And the gatekeeping that was involved with this question as sort of heading the possibility of research off at the past, this question about the literary quality, entirely prejudicial, right? And obviously, as you and your listeners know, entirely uninformed about the quality that does exist in science fiction, fantasy, in horror. But near to it, I have started to think more recently is an interesting question about reception. What do we do with the fact that things are worth studying, but might not be enjoyed by the people who study them? And so this is a question which I offer up to the listeners and to fandom generally. What does the Academy do with the fact that there is obviously deep expertise, real expertise outside the Academy, but that should be brought into the research context? And I ask it partly because and I'm here talking with such a one. There are people who know so much more about science fiction than I or any classically trained scholar does. We need their help to sort of make this field possible. And from my students' perspective currently, there are examples of horror which will obviously be relevant, but they simply don't want to watch or read. Mm-hmm. So how do we deal with that? This question, again, we go back to the very beginning, is all of this a labor of love? And if you don't love the material, but nonetheless it must be studied, how's that supposed to work? So
the gatekeeping is something that we sci-fi writers have dealt with, not as much in modern times, but I've talked before about how Heinlein pushed hard to get published in the mainstream magazines and then by major publishing houses, when before him, publishers would barely even touch sci-fi, and it was all in the genre magazines.
That's right. And yet I'll say this goes back to the sort of terminology I talked about at the beginning. The field that I'm in is called classics. Historically, it has been called classics. But to most people, the word classics doesn't mean Greek and Roman literature. The sort of running joke in the field is you say that you work with classics and someone asks, oh, Jane Austen? And it's because, of course, and this is at the heart of reception studies, what a classic is, what counts as central to a given field is specific to that field. Specific to the field and modulated by people's knowledge and their own interest. And it's perfectly obvious that there are classics of science fiction. And so the interest of the subfield could be summarized as asking, what is the relationship between classics of science fiction and classics in other fields? What's the crossover there?
Yeah, and I've built this whole podcast around works that are considered classics of science fiction. And there are a lot of them from the 50s and 60s, a disproportionate number. Mm-hmm. But there are modern classics too. The most recent one on my list is Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice from 2013.
Yes, the first of which I have read. Just wonderful. And that process of a thing becoming a classic, of course, is so complex. And we would think of things like annual awards. Interesting to see science fiction historically very conscious of the interaction between, but the difference between authors and readers. To have those two segments as well as sort of researchers. What a complicated process for something to be considered a classic. And this is the last answer I can give to sort of why this field, what is distinctive about it. I keep saying perfectly obvious, but it should be perfectly obvious to scholars. And I think your readers will know this. So many more people will encounter, let me try to be more precise about this. So many more people who aren't already in the other culture's tradition will encounter something like Rama, thanks to Clarke, than will encounter it in an academic or scholarly context. And I'll bring that back to my own field of ancient Greece and Rome. Many, many orders of magnitude more people will encounter the god Apollo in Who Mourns for Adonais than they, or in Joe Walton's Just City, than will encounter him in a course on classical mythology. So from that perspective, the kind of fact is that reception history is how, again, orders of magnitude more people encounter classical mythology. It's not through classical scholarship, although that may be there by proxy. Presumably Roddenberry or the writers of the episode had done some kind of homework. But we're interested in how, finally, many more people learn about antiquity in some form through things like science fiction television, science fiction cinema, the classics of the genre, than they do through scholarship or the academy. Alex, I'm enjoying this so much. I'm afraid I'm also reaching the limit of my time. But if there are other questions we should try to get to that can be edited in?
Just a couple. Talking about the history of science fiction, there are two questions I asked everybody, and okay. I feel like I might know the answer to both of them at this point. But first is, what do you consider to be the first science fiction novel?
What do I consider to be the first science fiction novel? As I have implied, I am taken by the argument that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, complex reception history, retrospectively is the first science fiction novel. And that has a lot to do with the status that it has achieved in modern popular culture, thanks especially to the film tradition, right? Thinking of something like James Whale's 1931 film adaptation, an adaptation by proxy since it draws on the plot structure of the stage version of the novel from just earlier in the century, and then on through sort of popularization in journalism of the Frankenstein figure as standing in for hybridity and crossover in science more generally. So I do think that there's that very strong case to be made that as novels go, Frankenstein has been most influential, kind of most broadly. So I guess I would agree with Brian Aldiss in, I forget which order of magnitude he uses at that point, billion or trillion year spree, that there is a strong argument, but again, I emphasize retrospectively for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein being that novel.
Yeah, I spent episodes 2 through 5 discussing the origins of science fiction from Thomas More's Utopia up to H.G. Wells, but I also agree that Frankenstein is retrospectively the first sci-fi novel.
Interesting. We're in the same boat then. Same camp.
And the second question is, do you have any must-reads in sci-fi that people might not have heard of?
Any must-reads that people might not have heard of? I've mentioned already Joe Walton's Thessaly Trilogy. I've been surprised by how many of my students haven't heard of it, so I put that out there too. Walton, of course, is perfectly well known. In a similar category, I would say many of the works by Catherynne M. Valente, and especially I would love to plump for her alternate and speculative historical novel, Radiance. I don't want to spoil too much about it if listeners are unfamiliar, but I will say that the premise is steampunk-ish, where this is a version of the solar system where the planets are closer enough together that they could be got to starting in the late 19th century into the early part of the 20th century. And what I won't spoil for anyone who does seek out Valente's Radiance is that her main interest is exploring not the science or even the sort of scientific possibility of that sort of spatial exploration, but the effect it had on 20th century culture. And that's embraced in such a sort of joyous or uplifted mode, but also in the texture of the novel itself, in such a range of weird ways that sort of reading through it, almost you're getting examples of what the culture is like in this fictional universe, sort of there in the structure of the novel itself. And so that would be my must read, which I happen to think not a lot of people have had access to. It seems to be a kind of a difficult book to get.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, Ben. Thank you for coming on.
Alex, thanks for the invitation and for the great questions and conversation.
This has been a writer's history of science fiction. You can find all of these interviews and the regular Reader's History of Science Fiction podcasts on all the major platforms. If you want to see more of my work, including some short fiction, you can visit my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. Dr. Stevens' profile can be found on Trinity University's website, and his book on this material is Classical Traditions in Science Fiction, edited by Brett M. Rogers and Benjamin Eldon Stevens. In the next episode of A Reader's History, we've finally finished with the new wave, and it's time to look at the next phase of sci-fi history, starting with one of the most iconic novels of the period. This is Larry Niven and the Return of Hard Sci-Fi. Thanks for listening.